we continue with the biography, before we continue about, James A Garfield himself, we should probably talk about a little bit about his personal life, and we should also definitely talk about the country as a whole. And I think the things that I probably alluded to with Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency, just the Republican and Democratic parties as a whole. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth because you have to understand, both parties in a lot of ways were struggling with, I guess you could say, their identities. Because, what I think people need to conceptualize sometimes too is that the entire Republican and Democratic parties, I guess you could say, the North and the were always divided between the North and the South, ideologically speaking, primarily with the function of slavery. It is an unfortunate reality of this country for the better part of 100 years. So once slavery is gone, what are you guys really, arguing about for the most part? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's still kind of states' rights and yada yada, but it's not really kind of like that in relative comparison. It's still basically just by region for the most part still what you voted for, but that was slowly changing. So the parties in general, both Republicans and Democrats, were kind of trying to figure out what direction they were respectively going to go. For the Democrats, there was a whole multitude of different facets. You have the strong, deep blue South. The vote blue no matter who. Southern Democrat, the Dixiecrats. Excuse me. But then you also had a couple of states' rights kind of Democrats in the North, but a lot of them in, say, New York, which would actually go to the Democrats in the election of 1876, because that's where the governor, Samuel J. Tilden, was from. But ultimately, the country's a little bit divided on what direction ultimately the country's going to go. And Democrats, a big reason why they voted for them is because, the Republicans pretty much had the presidency, the Congress for effectively outside of Andrew Johnson, the better part of 20 plus years since the Civil War. So, by the time of the election of 1880 and 1876, they're kind of tired of Republicans. That's just the truth. And Republicans themselves were trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do. They were the party that freed the slaves, and they didn't know what direction to really go after that. And they were basically just America first, yada, yada, yada. And that's all great. Until, you start being corrupt and you start doing all the things that ultimately, some good, slavery or freeing the slaves and doing some good things in Reconstruction, but then selling their souls in a lot of ways for the election of 1877, which Garfield's going to be a part of, or 1876 that Garfield's going to be a part of. And it's a little bit difficult because there's ideological differences within the party themselves. You have 2-3 different factions, the stalwarts, half-breeds, etc., and both of them are trying to argue for effectively little things, little nuances like tariffs, for the most part. And basically this is kind of in a lot of ways the beginning of, I don't want to say modern politics, but this is also in a lot of ways the beginning of, just this stop being, this is always a country of capitalism and stuff, and now it's for the most part a country of controlled capitalism, or or just unrestricted capitalism for the most part. And this is where I think more modern times are going to be seen here, along with the technologies, etc., yada yada, third, fifth, whatever fucking industrial revolution, pardon my language. But ultimately, if you want to see modern politics in a lot of ways, it really starts around this era when big business really starts encroaching on government. Some of the first billionaires are going to start existing around this particular point in time. And I'm probably going to beat this like a dead horse for the next probably 2 or 3 episodes, to be quite honest with you. And not just episodes in parts, but also just in, presidents for the most part. So, I mean, this is just in part what the very least the country's like. The country's very different. Ideologically speaking, Republicans have their own, I guess you could say political class, not even political classes, but political machines. Democrats have their own political machines. Farmers are trying to kind of co-opt together. The election is very serious for the most part. At least to the multitude of people in this country. Like, you think a lot of people turned out for the 2020 election. I mean, 80% of the eligible voting population had actually voted in both, I believe, 1876 and for sure 1880 presidential elections. The heart and soul of the country, to a lot of these people, is on the line. And I think it's really interesting to note for the most part. Now about Garfield himself. Garfield's a fascinating man. and a very fascinating president. He's very just... The words can't really describe what I'm thinking about when I think of James A. Garfield. But I'll probably just list off some things and then kind of just go from there. First and foremost, he is the last president to actually be born in a log cabin. Every single president from this point on will actually be born in a hospital, house, etc., etc. You know how it goes. He was also ambidextrous. Could write with either hand and would basically show off his hyper intelligence for the most part. Write Latin in one hand and then Greek in another hand, and he knew a whole bunch of different languages, love languages. And he's the only president in this country's history to be both a congressman, a senator-elect, and president-elect at the exact same time, when he's going to run for the presidency and then eventually get it in a very fascinating situation. It's a very complicated situation, his presidency, but I'll get to that in a second. Personally, do I think Garfield's a good man? I think in part he could be, and in parts his upbringing showed that he really could be, but at the same time it's always complicated with every single person, and everyone has their own perspective, point of view, and no one's perfect. I think once he got married, eventually became a faithful husband. When they were, he and his wife Lucrezia were engaged, he actually took on several lovers. There was actually a note in one of the books that, just in case that he would ever basically leave her or find herself unmarried, that she wanted to earn her own salary for the most part and become self-sufficient, which, kudos to her. And it's tough to really look at certain men like that, because even for him, and back then, it's, if you're not faithful, come on, like, what are we doing, people? Come on, what are we doing? And I don't know, it's very complicated. It tends to down my optimism, I guess you could say, on the character of a particular man, especially one who believes in the things that he could be. And, there's a lot more evidence that just goes to show, at least with Garfield, that, he wasn't as strong as a lot of people would like to think that he was, and it also just shows that, he's a very imperfect human being. I think he believed in a lot of the right things, but ultimately failed in a lot of endeavors and a lot of things that ultimately just lead me to feel a little apprehensive in liking him. I think I like Hayes a little bit better, and I'm indifferent ultimately to him, and a lot of people like Garfield for whatever reason far more so, and I think it's probably because he's a good politician and ultimately ideologically speaking a radical Republican in a lot of those ways, and a very liberal like-minded individual and person with solid economic ideas, I guess you could say, or solid safe economic ideas. Without further ado, Rutherford B. Hayes will win the election of 1876. The Compromise of 1876 and 1877, whatever you want to call it. I've detailed previously in the Hayes episode, but for the most part, Hayes will win the presidency. Reconstruction will end in the South, and basically, it's going to be rough. The country's going to be very different once Garfield becomes president, but I'll get to that in just a second. But for James A. Garfield, this is a very fascinating point for him. Once Hayes becomes the president and effectively emerges as the president, Hayes and Garfield, for the most part, they get pretty close. I think they have some genuine, relatively speaking, some respect for one another, I guess you could say. And ultimately speaking, Rutherford B. Hayes and James A. Garfield really rely on each other. James A. Garfield for more political, advantageous positions for the most part to rise up through Congress, and Hayes wanted him to basically be his eye within Congress itself. Although they didn't have a majority within Congress, James A. Garfield would actually be the House Minority Leader by that particular point in time, and actually had a lot of sway, relatively speaking and ideologically speaking, with both parties, Republicans and Democrats, for the most part, based off of economics, based off of some political stuff. He was a very well-respected politician, and his numbers only going to rise during the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. And I mean, they get pretty close. Rutherford B. Hayes is basically like, hey man, you should totally run for governor of Ohio. It'll help you get to become the president. And basically, Garfield, for the most part, is kind of just like, okay, I'd rather just be a senator, to kind of go in that direction instead of doing all this stuff. But ultimately, at least for the beginning part of the Hayes administration, he really becomes Rutherford B. Hayes' eyes and ears within Congress, at least in terms of the Republican minority within the House. That didn't mean it was always going to be easy. In fact, it was quite difficult for James A. Garfield while he was in Congress. He was a minority leader, and despite having a lot of say, a lot of things, he gave up a Senate seat, by the way. You have to understand, to stay in the House for Garfield, there was a Senate seat open. I think it was because of John Sherman, and actually had been elevated to become the Treasury Secretary, so there was going to be a Senate seat open, and he basically stayed in there to fight specifically in Congress for several things. One of those things was that weird Bland Allison Act, where they purchased large quantities of silver and basically use it as legal tender, and ultimately that would fail, relatively speaking. But for the most part, whole fundamental point being that it was going to be hard fought, and a lot of respect will be gained from the Republican Party and just in general from everyone for the most part within Congress. He had a tough job, and he did his job, which is one thing that I can definitely give some admiration to James A. Garfield, at least in that respect, in that regard. He did what was asked of him, and specifically as president, was to, do that. Anyways, it's going to be very, relatively speaking, for the most part, an uneventful 4 years for James A. Garfield. Maybe some law stuff for the most part. There's one little thing that one of the books talks about is he made this weird trapezoid Pythagorean theorem, or trapezoid proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Again, just showing off that brain. Fascinating little thing. I don't want to go too into that. And he just basically went more religious as the years went by, for the most part. And I'm just going to fast forward because I'm going to try and shorten these episodes and shorten these things so that they don't end up being 15 hours long. So let's just go with it. And I'm just going to skip forward to it. Election of 1880. Rutherford B. Hayes isn't going to run for a second term, and basically it's kind of wide open. Despite the negative attitudes towards Republicans, they're still very popular. They still have that positive outlook, I guess you could say, in terms of, we are the party that literally defeated slavery, so y'all can just, back off on that for the most part. Even though that party's low-key kind of gone. It's been gone for quite some time. So anyways, there is a potential opening, relatively speaking, for the presidency, and there's actually quite a few different people that are actually kind of going to be a part of it. There's a lot of different individuals there from different ideological perspectives within the Republican Party itself that are actually trying to fight for it. You got the old man, basically last remnant of what would be the original Republican Party in a lot of ways, Ulysses S. Grant, a stalwart, and you got James G. Blaine, the half-breed senator from Maine, and then, there's other individuals and people that might have some votes to be put in, like John Sherman himself. I believe at one point it was in the convention, the Republican National Convention. They went through like 40 ballots or something like that, or 30 ballots, and it was basically a three-way tie between Grant, Blaine, and Sherman. And remember, at this particular point, you only need like 50% of the vote to actually get the nomination, and it's just difficult, and just shows in a lot of ways the Republican Party is really trying to struggle to find an identity, kind of figure out what direction they're going to be going in. Which, as you can see, at least throughout entirely for history, for the most part, for at least some time, the person that you choose is ultimately going to be the person that's going to be the leader of the party for however long he's going to be in office for, and depending on the type of man you choose, the person you choose specifically, it could be for decades, like that's why it's little things like choose the right guy, because, you can get FDR in, next thing you know, we're basically going towards the direction of old school to very much more of a modern interpretation of what liberalism is today with him, or you pick a guy like Reagan, and the Republican Party is basically conservative for the next 40 years at this particular point, by this point, until, Trump comes in the office. Whole point being that, you gotta choose the right guy, and every single guy could be the guy that's gonna change the country and change how the next 20 years of America is gonna look like. And that's why in this particular, I guess you could say, Republican National Convention, it's very interesting. It's a bit of a fight for what is old school and Grant versus what is more, I guess you could say, a liberal-minded perspective with Sherman and Blaine, and it's really interesting. And ultimately, things end up getting very interesting in Garfield's perspective and point of view. I talked about it in the opening, but for the most part, James A. Garfield is in Chicago. He's at the Chicago Republican National Convention, where the votes are actually being cast out for a whole bunch of people. He's actually not even there for himself. He has no need, no want to actually become the president of the United States. He's fully comfortable being a United States House representative and potential Senate member. He's actually would win his election to become a senator. Sorry, around this particular point in time, which I think is really, really interesting. Because remember, back then, there was no direct elections of your senators. The state legislature actually chose for you, with Sherman effectively out for the most part, and Hayes out. No need for him to actually be a part of, the Congress for the most part. He was just like, okay, I'll go for the Senate for the most part. But like I said, he had no intention of actually running, so it was a last-minute decision. He actually gave a speech. He was there backing John Sherman as the guy for the most part, and he effectively was just like, vote for Sherman because he's going to be the guy that's going to do all this stuff. And then everyone's like, hey, what about Garfield? Yeah, Garfield, right? Yeah, Garfield. Yeah, Garfield. Yeah, oh my God, Garfield. I would probably look at Garfield as more of like as a Gerald Ford kind of individual. Like, he's someone that's just so content with just being in Congress and doesn't really have any aspirations to do really anything else meaningfully. And yet, at the same time, it's like, he kind of just gets thrown in there to actually be the president of the United States of America, which I think is really, really interesting. Same exact kind of caliber kind of individual, politically speaking, and I think in terms of their particular interest within the actual presidency, I think it's relatively speaking the same. And for Garfield, he's kind of just like, yeah, let's vote for Sherman. And everyone's like, oh, Garfield, okay, Garfield. Like, and I think in a lot of people's minds back then, it was like, excuse me, we've had like 30 ballots, and we can't not decide for the life of us who's actually going to be the next president of the United States of America. And this is our next Republican candidate for the presidency of the United States of America. And they're going back and forth. Grant, he doesn't seem like the strong candidate he was. He had a complicated presidency, and above all else, this would be his third term. And he wasn't doing too well health-wise, if I'm going to be 100% honest. But ultimately, just, come on, like, there's a lot of rules that would be broken if Grant became the president. And then Blaine is a complicated candidate along with Sherman. And effectively, you're kind of getting the same person, ultimately, with those two people. So when you look at James A. Garfield, you're looking at someone who is kind of literally in the middle of everything. So after the 33rd ballot or 34th ballot, they're kind of like, okay. So on the 33rd, 34th ballot, I think 16 votes actually went to James A. Garfield. On the next ballot, Garfield received 50 votes. And basically just people were just like, oh. And Garfield's basically pleading with them, making speeches. Please don't vote for me. I don't want this. I don't want to do this. And basically by the time the 36th vote came, everyone's like, all right, fuck it. Let's just do it. Let's go with it. Especially with Blaine and Sherman effectively rooting for James A. Garfield for the most part, at least against Grant, relatively speaking. And at that point, he actually just had been, elected into the actual U.S. Senate prior to the convention, too. So he's a Senate-elect kind of person, and he would end up winning the Republican nomination, 399 votes to Grant, Grant's 306, and he's going to be a Republican nominee for the presidency of the United States of America. And now I think this is going to be important too. Chester A. Arthur, the 21st president, and I think the 21st vice president actually too, because of he's not never mind, my brain's not working. Anyways, he's going to become the vice president for James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield did not get a choice. They actually just kind of threw him in there. Ross Conkling and all his goons within New York ultimately were basically putting him into that position. And Garfield was really actually apprehensive for the most part for choosing Arthur, but ultimately chose him because of their ideological differences, I guess you could say. It's kind of like Trump choosing Pence in a lot of ways. It's like Trump, you don't think of him as like a religious minded kind of person, but it's like you might as well just choose the most hardcore religious kind of person and just go for it. And ultimately it's kind of in a lot of ways, ideologically speaking, not in terms of religious aspects, the same, at least concept wise. It's basically get more voters to vote for your candidate for the most part, but that's basically set up. It's James A Garfield and Chester A Arthur as the Republican Party's nominees. The election of 1880 is going to be between the Republican nominees, James A. Garfield as Vice President Chester A. Arthur, against the Democratic nominee Winfield Scott Hancock and William H. English. Winfield Scott Hancock, a big Civil War veteran, mainly he would effectively end up becoming one of the military governors there for, I think, Texas and Louisiana at one point, and did a whole bunch of different things. He's basically the Democrats' man, though. And the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats is William H. English. He's the former congressman from Indiana, I believe. And let me put it to you this way: the election of 1880 is, I think, a really interesting one. I think this really showed how divided the country still is. Effectively speaking, let me rephrase that. How divided the country is, but also how indifferent really the country is to one another, and how, how similar they are at the same time, really. I mean, like, I'll just go and tell you the election results now. James A. Garfield will win this election with an electoral vote count of 214 to 155 for Winfield Scott Hancock. But in terms of total votes, I mean, James A. Garfield basically wins with barely, like, maybe 2,000 votes for the most part, in terms of at least the popular vote count. 19 states apiece for both of them. I mean, it's staggering, insane, really, how fundamentally different both these candidates are, and how really different they are, which is very little, to be quite honest with you. The only thing they really argued about in terms of the campaign trail, for the most part, is just tariffs. That's basically it. And basically Hancock just basically saying, hey, you should probably look at James A. Garfield being a part of that credit mobiler scandal. And Garfield and his campaign basically saying, yeah, this guy was a pretty bad governor, yada yada, and his idea of tariffs is not really looking too good. And the Republicans, like I said before, were not super popular even during Hayes' administration, so it wasn't looking too good, and things only became a little more difficult for Garfield because ultimately, like I said, the ideological political differences would lead to what will be the treaty on Fifth Avenue in New York, I guess you could say, because New York was the big state that might go back to the Democrats again in the election of 1880, and it was a bit of a problem because the Republicans were ultimately divided between the stalwarts and the half-breeds. Half-breeds, I guess you could say, being a little more liberal-minded, or rather than stalwarts for the most part. Or is it backwards? I don't know. I'm really tired. And I do apologize if I get some things wrong. But ultimately, there is a fundamental political difference between the two factions of the Republican Party. And Garfield ultimately ends up going to New York to meet with the stalwarts in general. And to basically say, hey, if you do this, I'll appoint this person here. I'll do this. I'll do that, And would make this a very contested election within New York itself. And ultimately, Garfield would be able to do the one thing that Hayes couldn't, and that was win New York, which is the big one. I mean, that's, I think at that time, the highest electoral vote count, and he still barely won that state, to be quite honest with you, too. And this election wasn't super fierce every single election ultimately is, at least ideologically speaking, between the two political parties, and the Republicans and Democrats, but ultimately, this is much more so, like, just whose side are you on, ultimately, and then just going back and forth on little scandals and whatnot that ultimately flitted the campaign. But like I said before, when I said the opening of the actual ending count, James A. Garfield did win this election. He won the election 214 to 155 to Winfield Scott Hancock's electoral vote count, and he will become the 20th president of the United States of America. First, let's talk about his cabinet and his administration. He's going to have a lot of people in his administration, most notably James G. Blaine, the guy who was trying to run for the presidency in the Republican National Convention that year exactly in 1880. Ultimately ended up failing, was going to win the Secretary of State-ship for him. It actually became kind of like a low-key, crazy Secretary of State, but James G. Blaine is a really fascinating politician. And there's guys who rise up through the ranks and ultimately end up becoming very important figures, relatively speaking, within their political careers. Guys like Henry Clay, etc., etc. Blaine's along the lines of that similar vein. I don't know if he was as corrupt. I would probably say he's much more paranoid. At one point, there's a couple stories that talk about, James G. Blaine basically being the right-hand man of James A. Garfield, and then Arthur, and then Benjamin Harrison, and effectively ends up becoming, wanting to run everything. He effectively ended up becoming, low-key, a great influence for the president himself specifically. Actually had one point having spies within the house, which it's only, it's you can't prove it, but anything. I'm not surprised, to be quite honest with you, if there were actual spies for Blaine within the White House itself, just for at least political purposes. A couple other notable people, I would probably say. Couple stalwarts in specific cabinet positions, Thomas James, and a whole bunch of them. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's eldest son, and I believe, technically speaking, the eldest and the only one of one of Abraham Lincoln's 4 children to actually survive into adulthood, will actually become the Secretary of War. Now, I just want to point out, his cabinet is really interesting, mainly because of the fact that a lot of it had to do with political appointments. Ross Conkling had a big influence within politics at this particular point in time, and really pushed forward a lot of the things that really occurred, just in terms of corruption and just New York, and had a lot of influence and say within his cabinet. But once James A. Garfield chose James G. Blaine, Blaine had his own, half-breed mob of political appointments that he wanted to put, and a lot of people he wanted to put into the administration, and have certain appointments just in general. Excuse me. And ultimately ended up just really battling each other for specific appointments until, relatively speaking, it became relatively even, I guess you could say, in terms of political equality between the two various factions. Is James A. Garfield ultimately is the middleman between the two opposing sides for the most part. Garfield will have one Supreme Court appointment, which is really fascinating for a guy who basically served maybe one year of his term before what I'll get to later, his assassination. President Hayes had nominated this guy, Stanley Matthews, to the Supreme Court right before he left, but the Senate decided not to basically go through with the nomination and left it open for James A. Garfield to do. So the first thing he does when he actually gets in is renominate Stanley Matthews to the Supreme Court. And in a very contested Senate vote, the Senate eventually confirms Matthews to the court, 23 to 23. I believe, for approving him effectively to join the Supreme Court. Now, Matthews is a bit of a fascinating figure. He's a politically motivated figure, but I think at the same time, too, at least in certain court cases, notably there's one court case in particular where Chinese, I think owners of a laundromat basically were being abused. And again, I'm probably misreading this, because these are articles I'm reading, specifically was being abused by state authority for the most part, and basically being just ramshackled by the political machine for, I guess you could say, purely political reasons and racial reasons, and ultimately ended up Matthews himself writing a specific decision that actually defended the actual Chinese laundromat owners for the most part under equal protection of the 14th Amendment, even though they were not United States citizens. So, it's little things like that I have some respect for. So, a very politically minded and motivated Supreme Court justice, but one that, I think he's the kind of person I think when like big things happen, he will probably end up deciding the right way for the most part, but it really ultimately depends, I guess you could say, for the most part. What is the country like when James A. Garfield ultimately is going to become the President of the United States of America? It's very complicated. It's in a weird point. Is probably the best way I could probably put it. We have to understand there's a lot of machinations going on, because it's not just the Industrial Revolution, it's also a cultural revolution. Progressive era is really ramping up in speed as unions are starting to become more prominent. Communism is a thing, and there's a lot of communes and people coming together, farmers basically coming together to basically just try and survive at this particular point in time. Cowboys are dying out in the West, The days of Red Dead Redemption are really losing as technology goes in a different direction. The economy is really going in a different direction. It's in a lot of ways beginnings of consumerism around this particular point in time. A lot of things are happening, and it's all happening at the same time. And on top of that, you have the differences between Republicans and Democrats, which are still basically location-based in a lot of ways. But that's changing too, because it's basically going from anti-authority and anti-government and anti-America in a lot of ways with the Democratic Party. And let me make that very clear, not anti-America in the sense of, constitutional rights and stuff. It's more of a moral authoritarianism and just authoritarianism in a way that, you think of the worst kind of being the villains, in my personal view, of Red Dead Redemption, the Pinkerton people who ultimately are working with the government to try and take down all these outlaws and stuff. And it's a lot of people had viewed those people in that particular light. And I'm not saying that Red Dead Redemption is the most accurate game in terms of history, and but I will admit that there is a feeling, an energy, and at least a fundamental belief that they actually get that right, I think, in relative comparison, in how people really thought about the government, first and foremost, and how people thought the implementation of the government ultimately was going. I mean, I'll get to him when I get to him, but Grover Cleveland, in a lot of ways, is kind of the anti-government kind of person in a lot of ways, and, very much so, well, he's not pro-union by any stretch of the imagination, actually, probably more so aligned with the Republican ideals in a lot of ways, but, for the most part, not using the government really in any meaningful way to do anything crazy like that, and I'll get to him when I get to Grover Cleveland, for the most part. But ultimately, the country is in a very fascinating point in 1880. Railroads are really expanding East Coast and West Coast. More people are leaving the East Coast to go into the West Coast. The states of like Colorado are starting to be populated. You have to understand, everything starts somewhere. California is becoming a very prominent state, and the country is starting to go into the modern world. So what are the events that occur during Garfield's presidency? And this effectively will only be about, relatively speaking, maybe 7 months or so since the inauguration. Maybe 5 months, actually. Because I think he technically dies in September. So really not a lot, at least in this part that I'm going to be talking about. First and foremost, Pinocchio. The book is actually going to be written by the Italian writer Colidi, which actually is, technically speaking, Little Wooden Boy, or Pinocchio. The second transcontinental railroad will actually be open and completed around this particular point in time. The Vatican will actually open its archives to scholars for the very first time. Little things like that. The American Red Cross is actually going to be a thing around this time. It's going to be started by Clara Barton, and a whole bunch of different independence movements are going to be going around across the world. Romania and Serbia are trying to snatch independence from Constantinople around this particular point in time. A lot of people are leaving, effectively, parts of the country with, especially in the West. They're going back east, and they're going back even further west because the droughts are hitting the country pretty hard. I mean, New York City even basically runs out of water at a certain point, which, let's just be honest, we live in luxury in relative comparison to a lot of these people back then. On July 2nd, James A. Garfield will be shot, but I'll get to that when I get to James A. Garfield after parts of what his presidency could have been, and then I'll detail the assassination in relative detail for the most part. Booker T. Washington, he's going to actually found the Tuskegee Institute within Alabama. The Vaporator, or Vaporetto, I don't even know what the hell you call that. It's a water bus introduced in Venice, which is really interesting because the book that I read says the number of gondolas end up dropping substantially, and it's just like, well, okay, that's pretty cool. Sitting Bull leads his band of Sioux Indians to surrender to the U.S. Army in Montana. Tsar Alexander II of Russia is assassinated, and his son Alexander III succeeds him, which I think is really interesting because Tsar Alexander III is going to be Tsar Nick. God, the one that's going to be killed during the Russian Revolution is the father. He is the father specifically of Tsar Nicholas. I might get my people mixed up. I should have looked every little tidbit up as I probably could have, but I'm rushing a lot of this, so I do apologize if it's all disoriented. The gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, is going to be really occurring around this particular point in time. And Tunisia becomes a French protectorate. Little tidbits that I tend to like.